There is a ward in a Toronto
beds are the
hospital in the
same
winter of
iron frames.
1921 where the
sheets
children
are
are
the same
dying
white.
slowly, and
The
everyone in
still
the building
forms
knows
are
it,
still.
and there is nothing anyone can do. The ward is quiet in the particular way that places become quiet when hope has been removed from them. The children are thin, not the thinness of poverty or appetite, but the thinness of a body consuming itself from the inside, burning through its own muscle, its own fat, its own organs, in a search for fuel it cannot find. Their breath smells of something sweet and chemical, like overripe fruit left in a warm room. Their eyes are sunken. Their skin hangs. They are, most of them, children who arrived here weighing too little, who will leave weighing less, who will not leave at all. This is what diabetes looked like before insulin. This is what it meant to receive that diagnosis. This is the story of a disease that killed almost everyone it touched, for thousands of years, until 11 months later when everything changed. In this video, we are going to live inside that world. We are going to understand what diabetes actually did to the human body before medicine had any answer for it. We are going to meet the physicians who spent careers watching patients die and could do nothing except slow the process. We are going to sit with the families who received the diagnosis and had to decide, in the privacy of their grief, how much time they were willing to buy and at what cost. And we are going to witness the moment, one of the most dramatic single moments in the entire history of medicine, when a discovery made in a university laboratory in Canada changed the meaning of a diagnosis that had been a death sentence since before the pyramids were built.
The ancient Egyptians documented diabetes since 1550 BCE.
The ancient Egyptians had a name for it.
This text describes excessive urination and wasting.
A papyrus dating to around 1550 BCE describes a condition in which the patient urinated excessively, lost weight rapidly, and died. They called it, roughly translated, the passing of too much water. 1,000 years later, a Greek physician named Aretias of Cappadocia gave it the name that survived, diabetes, from the Greek word for siphon. The body, he wrote, was like a pipe through which water flowed without stopping. He described it as a melting down of the flesh and limbs into urine. He was not wrong. He was describing the mechanism without understanding it, which is what medicine did for the next 2,000 years. In the 2nd century CE, another physician noticed something remarkable. He tasted the urine of diabetic patients and found it sweet.
Sweet.
This was not eccentricity. Tasting urine was a legitimate diagnostic tool in a world without laboratory equipment.
Observations
The sweetness told him something was wrong with the way the body processed what it ate.
A new patient presented
But
today.
he had no framework for understanding
urine.
what that something was. The sweetness was noted and filed and the patients continued to die. For most of human history, the story of diabetes was a story of observation without comprehension. Physicians watched the patients waste away. They tasted the urine, watched the thirst
Just
become
a little,
unquenchable,
thank you.
watched the weight fall
I'll
off
leave this
bodies
here.
that were eating
I need to
everything they could
update the
find.
chart.
They
The word
described it with
mellitus,
precision and
added in the
helplessness in
17th
equal
century,
measure.
is Latin for
The
honey,
name mellitus,
distinguishing
from the
the
Latin
sweet
for
urine
honey,
disease.
was added in the 17th century to
Diabetes
distinguish the sweet
insipidus.
urine variety
Don't
from
know,
a
a
different
challenging
condition called
affliction.
diabetes insipidus,
Distinct
which also
mechanisms,
caused excessive
same ancient
urination
name.
but had a different mechanism entirely. By then, physicians had established that the disease was real, that it was distinct, that it killed, and that they had no idea how to stop it. What they didn't understand was this: inside every cell in the human body, there is a doorway. Glucose, the fuel the body runs on, the sugar that comes from everything you eat, can only enter that doorway if it is accompanied by a specific molecule. That molecule is insulin. Without insulin, the glucose circulates in the blood,
The sugar
building
levels
up
are
to
critical.
toxic levels,
The cells are
while the
starving.
cells
I know,
themselves
Doctor.
starve.
We've done everything
The
we
body,
can. I understand.
sensing starvation,
Just watch him
begins
carefully.
breaking down fat and then muscle for
ketone
fuel.
bodies,
The
blood
byproducts
acidosis,
of that breakdown,
muscle,
acids called
amino
ketones,
acids,
accumulate in the
ketoacidosis.
blood, turning it acidic. The kidneys, trying
Here
to
you are,
filter out the
child.
excess
Drink
glucose,
slowly now.
pull water from the body to flush it out,
More.
creating the relentless thirst and urination that observers had described for millennia. And eventually, the blood becomes so acidic, the cells so starved,
pulse.
the body so depleted, that the patient loses consciousness and dies.
God help him.
This is diabetic ketoacidosis.
Inevitable without
This is what
intervention.
killed most diabetics
This killed
before
most diabetics
1922.
before 1922.
It did not take long.
A swift and total
A
process.
child with type 1 diabetes, the kind in which the immune system destroys the insulin-producing cells entirely, could go from diagnosis to death in weeks. Nobody understood any of this mechanism until the late 19th century. And understanding the mechanism did not, by itself, save
Without
anyone.
the pancreas,
In
diabetes manifested in
1889,
days.
two German
matches
physiologists
the
named
symptoms
Joseph von
exactly.
Mering and Oskar
The evidence
Minkowski
is
removed the
irrefutable.
pancreas
The
from a
pancreas
dog and watched
produces
it
an
develop
essential
diabetes
substance for
within
sugar
days.
processing.
This
It is
was the
time to
first
report
direct
this
evidence
finding.
that the pancreas was the
Geheimnis
organ
entdeckt.
responsible,
Die
that
Substanz
something
muss
it produced
isoliert
was
werden.
essential for the
Wir
body's
sind so
ability to
nah
process
dran.
sugar.
Wie kann das
They
möglich
had found
sein?
the location of the answer. They had not found the answer. For the next 30 years, laboratories across Europe and North America attempted to extract whatever it was the pancreas was making. The attempts failed, one after another. The substance, insulin, as it would eventually be called, was fragile.
Another one?
The digestive enzymes also produced by the pancreas
another
destroyed
one?
it during extraction before it could be isolated. Researchers got close. Some of them got very close. None of them got there. And in the meantime, patients continued to die. Here is what those decades looked like from inside a physician's office.
The readings continue
You are
to
a
rise.
doctor practicing in Boston or London
Nothing
or
I do
Berlin
makes a
sometime between
difference.
1890 and 1920.
The time is noted.
You understand, better than any physician in history before you,
Thank you, doctor.
what diabetes is doing to your
I
patient's body.
understand now.
You can measure the
color is
sugar
a
in their
deep
blood.
amber. That's a high
You can
reading.
watch the numbers rise. You know that the
trend is
pancreas
clear,
is
it's
failing to
rising.
produce something essential, and you know that without it, your patient will die. And there is nothing you can do. Or rather, there is one thing.
No, not this.
One intervention that had been
This?
discovered
No,
empirically,
not this.
by trial
Only
and
this.
suffering, that could slow
A
the
few
progression
months,
of the disease
maybe.
and
We
extend
will
life
make her
by
as
months or
comfortable as we
sometimes a few
can.
years. It was not a cure.
Thank you so much.
It was not even close to comfortable. But it was all there was. Starvation. The discovery of the starvation diet as a management strategy for diabetes belongs
Glycosuria
primarily to a
reduction and
Boston
caloric
physician
restriction
named Frederick
protocol.
Allen,
It's all
who in
right
the
here.
1910s
We've gotta
developed
try
what he
this.
called the starvation treatment and what his colleagues sometimes
Balance the
called,
scale.
with a mixture of admiration and horror,
The meat is
Allen
sufficient.
starvation diet.
Now the vegetables. The
Allen's
regime
logic
must
was
be
brutal
absolute.
and correct within its own limits. If the body couldn't process glucose, reduce the glucose. Restrict carbohydrates to the absolute
Small,
minimum.
clear broth.
Then restrict
Just
everything
enough.
else to fat, protein, total calories,
Allen protocol
until the urine
confirmed.
ran clear of sugar. Then slowly, carefully, add back just enough food to sustain life without triggering the fatal accumulation of glucose in the blood. The diet worked. In the narrow technical sense that it reduced blood sugar and extended survival, it worked. Patients who would have died within weeks of diagnosis could survive for months, occasionally for a few years. Allen had patients who lived for years on his protocol. But the cost of that survival was almost incomprehensible. The diet required patients to consume as few as 500 calories a day. Sometimes less. For context, a moderately active adult needs roughly 2,000 calories to maintain body weight. 500 calories is the intake of someone in the early stages of starvation. That was the point, that was the mechanism, but it meant that the patients who survived their diabetes were simultaneously starving to death by design. They became skeletal. Their hair fell out. They were too weak to climb stairs. Children
Careful,
stopped
little one.
growing.
Just one more step.
Adults lost the
can't.
ability to work.
You're doing so well.
The smell of ketones, that same sweet, chemical smell that characterized diabetic patients, was present in Allen's patients too, because a body living on 500 calories is also burning its own tissue for fuel, just doing it more slowly than a body in full diabetic crisis. Families watched their children become shadows of themselves and were told this was success. This was survival. The alternative was faster. Some patients refused. Some patients decided that a shorter life with food was preferable
real.
to a longer life
Yes.
in starvation.
Real.
This was not an irrational choice. Allen's own records document patients who chose to stop the diet, who went home and ate what they wanted, who died within months but died having tasted bread and meat and sweetness.
I don't understand
It
what
is
they were
hard to
thinking.
read those records without understanding, completely, why they made that choice.
He didn't survive that treatment.
What made it dangerous, beyond the obvious, was the precision it required. Too much food and the patient went into ketoacidotic crisis.
Too
Too
high.
little and they starved to death.
Much too
The
high.
line between survival and either kind of death was narrow and required constant monitoring that most families, in the early 20th century, simply could not sustain. There were no glucometers. No continuous
I can't
monitoring.
quite make this out.
Physicians
Try holding it a
tested
bit closer
urine
to
for
the
sugar
light.
using chemical
It's still
reagents
so
and a color
ambiguous in
scale.
here.
Are you
Patients
sure?
or families learned to do the same at home, squinting at vials of urine in kitchen light, trying to read a color that meant the difference between adding one more bite to tomorrow's meal or
It
removing
feels like
it.
living death.
Alan's patients called the regimen, amongst themselves,
We're in
living
this
death.
together.
It was not a phrase born of ingratitude. It was an accurate description of what they were doing. They were living, and it felt like dying, and the only reason to continue was the faint possibility that
Nurse,
something better
please.
might come.
My son needs help.
In 1919,
All right,
a
sir.
young physician
Please
named
tell me
Leonard
his name and
Thompson was
symptoms.
admitted to Toronto
Name,
General
Leonard
Hospital.
Thompson. Age, 14.
He was 14 years
Weight,
old.
65 pounds.
He weighed 65
Admission date,
pounds.
1919.
He had been on Alan's starvation diet for 2 years, and the diet had stopped working. His blood sugar was rising again despite everything. There was nothing more his physicians could do. His family was told to prepare. He was not alone in that ward. There were other children like him, children who had survived longer than expected, who had endured the diet with a discipline that adults found extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure, who had arrived at the end of what survival had to offer. The ward smelled of ketones and antiseptic. The children slept a great deal. When they were awake, they were quiet with the particular exhaustion of bodies that have been running on nothing for too long. The nurses and physicians who worked that ward did so under a specific kind of weight, the weight of caring for patients you cannot save, of doing everything correctly and watching death come anyway. It was into this specific context, this ward, this smell, this weight, that Frederick Banting arrived with a syringe. Frederick Banting was not, by any measure, the
dogs
most
with
obvious
diabetes,
person to solve the
ligating their
problem of
pancreas duct,
diabetes.
It stopped the degeneration
He was
of
a
the acini.
29-year-old
I
surgeon
believe I
with
can
no
extract
research
the-
background,
Professor
no
McLeod.
laboratory experience, and a medical
Professor
practice
McLeod,
in London,
my theory on
Ontario
insulin's
that was
effect on
struggling to
diabetes is
attract
groundbreaking.
patients.
Your data.
He had read a paper about the
Permission is
pancreas,
hereby granted
developed
for
a
use of
theory about why
laboratory No.
previous
4
extraction
from May
attempts had
17
failed,
through the
and
summer
written a
term.
letter to a professor at the University of Toronto named
Well,
John
Best,
McLeod asking for laboratory
it.
space and some dogs to
It's
experiment
not
on.
much. But we'll make it
McLeod
work.
was
Bring the
skeptical.
notebooks.
The measurements
Banting was
are
persistent.
consistent.
McLeod gave him the
Excellent.
laboratory, gave him
Proceed
an
with the
assistant,
extraction,
a
Frederick.
21-year-old
Will do,
medical
Charles.
student named Charles Best, and
think
left
the
for
filing.
vacation in Scotland while they worked.
I think we have something
What
here.
followed that summer of 1921 is one of the most compressed,
Sample
chaotic,
16, reading
and consequential
247,
research stories in medical
247.
history.
Not there yet, but
Banting
closer.
and Best worked in a
Adjust setting
cramped
3 down,
laboratory
we keep
through a
going.
Toronto
The
summer
digestive
with
enzymes
inadequate
produced by the
equipment,
pancreas were destroying the
insufficient
insulin
funding,
during extraction.
dying
Yes.
dogs,
If the
failed
duct is tied, the
extractions,
enzyme cells
and
would
results
die, but
that
the
were
insulin cells
ambiguous
would live.
enough
You've
that
done
any
it.
reasonable
Duct
person
ligation
might have
approach.
stopped.
November
They
14th,
did not stop.
1920.
Banting's insight was specific and correct. The digestive enzymes produced by the pancreas
cleaner.
were destroying
Definitely.
the insulin during extraction.
No X
If
this
he could
time.
prevent those enzymes from being produced, by tying
Still
off the
slow.
pancreatic duct and allowing
Adjusting.
the enzyme-producing cells to atrophy while
Good.
the
Let's record
insulin-producing cells
There.
survived,
Critical
he could
stage
extract
passed.
insulin in a form that
God
wasn't
damn it.
immediately destroyed.
Another failure,
worked.
Frederick. No.
Not perfectly,
Not yet.
not
Clean
cleanly,
this up.
not
We go
without
again.
setbacks that would have ended the project if
Extraction
either
batch
man had been
14.
less stubborn.
Ready.
But it worked.
This could be it.
By the fall
We
of
need to be sure.
1921, they had
Prepare
an
the
extract
animal.
they called Iltin, later renamed insulin, that could lower blood sugar
think
in
we've done it.
diabetic dogs and
Yes.
keep them alive.
We have.
They purified it further
Good
with the
morning,
help of a
everyone.
biochemist
I have
named
it.
James Collett.
Let's proceed.
And in January of 1922, they brought it to Leonard Thompson. The first injection made him sicker, an impure extract, a reaction. Collett worked through the night improving the preparation. The second injection, 12 days later, worked. Leonard Thompson's blood sugar dropped.
It's lower.
He did not go into crisis.
Significantly lower.
He
The
ate.
lowest range, Mr. MacLeod.
He gained weight.
Leonard
He
will
went
eat
home.
tonight.
He lived for another 13 years, dying eventually of pneumonia unrelated to his diabetes, at the age of 27. He was the first
well,
human being
son.
to survive
We're
type 1
outside now.
diabetes
Yes,
with
Pa.
insulin.
It's cold.
What happened
Just a
next
little
is almost
further, Leonard.
impossible to
You're
process
strong.
without emotion,
I believe
even
this
at a
section is
century's
ready
distance.
for final review. I
Banting
agree,
and
the data
Best and
looks
McLeod
solid.
and Collett published
Let's
their
proceed with
findings in
publication.
early
Yes,
1922.
finally.
The news spread through the medical community with a speed unusual for the era. Physicians who had spent careers watching diabetic patients
journal is
die
clear.
began writing to
Alan's
Toronto
diet is
asking for
working.
the extract.
But these children were weeks from
Families
death.
who had children
There
on
might be a
Alan's
last-minute
starvation
reprieve for
diet,
him, nurse.
children who were
Asks
weeks from
how
death,
to obtain the
wrote
treatment.
letters that read like the
How
letters of
quickly, what
people
is
who had been
needed.
told there might be a last-minute reprieve from an execution
running
already
out of
scheduled.
time.
For their work
Banting
on
and
insulin, the
McLeod
Nobel
were awarded
Prize
the
in
Nobel
Physiology
Prize
or
in
Medicine is
Physiology or
awarded to
Medicine in
Frederick Banting
1923,
and John
the
Macklin.
fastest Nobel Prize in the history of the award at that time,
I believe this
granted
belongs to
just
you.
1 year after the first successful human treatment. Banting
Thank you, I
publicly
appreciate
shared
it.
his prize money with Best, furious that Best had been excluded from the Nobel. McLeod publicly shared his with Collett. The acrimony and the generosity existed in the same moment, as they often do in the aftermath of a discovery that changes the world. Within a year, insulin was being manufactured by Eli Lilly in the United States. Within a decade, it was available across the industrialized
And
world.
that's how the insulin works.
The wards where diabetic
He's
children
looking
had
much
been
better,
dying
isn't he?
quietly were transformed.
Wow, that drawing
The
is
children were
excellent.
still sick.
Time for your
Insulin was not a
injection.
cure, it was a treatment, requiring
Yes,
daily
nurse.
injections and constant monitoring for the rest of a patient's life. But they were
Time for a
alive.
change. Allen protocol
went home.
obsolete.
They grew up.
Finally.
Frederick Allen's starvation diet was abandoned almost overnight. The physicians who had administered it, who had spent years presiding over the slow starvation of patients in the name of survival, did not, for the most
go,
part,
girl.
celebrate the discovery that made their work obsolete.
It's good to see her leave.
They celebrated the survival of their patients. The obsolescence of their methods was simply
Eat
the price
slowly,
of
dear.
progress,
I
paid by
am.
everyone
It's
who had
just-
endured those methods
I
in the
miss
years
this.
before a better
The
answer
data here
existed.
confirms a consistent approach.
What modern
despite the
science
different
reveals
methodologies
about those
employed.
years carries a particular
Yes, but
kind of
consider the
complexity.
outcomes in the later studies.
The starvation
Question,
diet was
how to
not
maintain
wrong.
life in the
It was the
absence of
correct
insulin.
answer to the
Answer,
correct question
reduce
given
the
the
glucose
tools
supply
available.
as far as possible. This
The
was
question
correct. This was all that was
how do
available.
you keep a diabetic patient
The
alive
guide
without
and
insulin?
the insulin.
And the
One
answer
without the
was,
other is
reduce
not
the
enough.
glucose load as
I
severely
see,
as
I
possible.
understand.
This is still, in a more refined form, part of the management of type 2 diabetes today. Dietary intervention,
Your weight
carbohydrate
has improved
restriction,
on insulin,
metabolic
but we need to
management,
manage the
these are not
carbohydrates.
relics of
This
pre-insulin
schedule
thinking.
is vital. And
They
this
are
new
active
dietary
treatment
guideline is
strategies.
key. Holding pattern,
What the
not
starvation
endpoint.
era got wrong
53
was the
pounds at
belief that it was
transition.
a sustainable
90,
endpoint
11
rather than a
pounds
holding
6 months
pattern.
later. My God, the
Allen's
difference.
patients were not being saved. They were being maintained in a state of controlled deterioration, and the physicians who administered the treatment knew this and did it anyway,
I understand
because
your
the
discomfort.
alternative,
We've
uncontrolled
made a slight
deterioration,
adjustment here.
was faster.
Please keep trying.
The
Yes,
deeper
doctor,
lesson,
I
the
will.
one that modern medicine
The
still
mechanism,
struggles with,
clear as day.
is about the gap
And
between
here,
observing a
nothing but
mechanism and
failure.
having a tool to address
We
it.
understand the what,
By
but lack the
1920,
how.
physicians understood
The knowledge
diabetes
is
better
complete.
than any generation
we know
before
of the
them.
pancreas, of the
They knew
glucose
the pancreas was
accumulation,
failing.
the cellular
They
starvation.
knew blood sugar
The
was the
diagnosis
problem.
confirms pancreatic
They
cancer.
knew the cells
What does
were
that mean?
starving.
It means there is no
That
cure.
knowledge did not save
We
anyone.
can offer a dietary protocol.
The gap between knowing what is happening and being able to do something about it is where patients live,
I wish I
and
had better
sometimes
news for
die,
you.
in every era
Thank you
of
for
medicine.
telling me.
We still live in that gap for many diseases today. Cancer of the pancreas. ALS.
The genetic
Alzheimer's
analysis
disease.
shows a specific defect.
We understand,
While we
the,
understand the
mechanisms with precision that would have
the
been
treatment
miraculous
options are
to a
limited at this
physician in
time.
1920.
What exactly does that mean?
We
The
cannot
readings
yet
remain
fix
stable.
them. The patients in those diseases are in the position of Leonard Thompson in that Toronto ward in
Thank you, nurse.
1919, correctly diagnosed, precisely monitored,
Doctor.
and waiting for something
hear
that
that?
may or may not arrive in time.
It's them.
What
Is
we
there
still
news?
do wrong, a century after insulin, is believe that having a treatment is the same as having solved a disease. Insulin saved millions of lives. It also created millions of lives spent managing a chronic condition that requires daily vigilance, that still causes devastating complications in
The
blood vessels
examination is
and nerves
complete.
and kidneys
The
and
retinal
eyes when
vessels
the
show
management
some
is
areas of
imperfect,
concern
that still
consistent with
shortens
diabetic
lives and limits
retinopathy.
bodies and demands, every single day, a level of attention to one's own biology that most people will never have to exercise. Type 1
I think I've got this
diabetes is
section
not
down now.
cured.
Quiet,
It is
please.
managed. The children in that Toronto ward grew up and had children of their own, and those children had children, and some of them are alive today, checking their continuous glucose monitors on their phones, calculating insulin doses in their heads,
All right, just a
living
little bit
full
more.
lives that exist in the
Okay.
space that Banting and Best
Good
opened for
job.
them in the summer
Now
of
finish up.
1921. They owe those lives to 2 young men in a cramped laboratory, to a summer's worth of stubbornness, to dogs that died so that children could live, to a biochemist who worked
Time
through
for
a
the
night
second
improving
injection.
a preparation that would be given to a 14-year-old boy who weighed 65 pounds and had nothing left to lose.
He's ready.
And they owe something, too, something harder to name, something we rarely acknowledge, to all the patients who came before. To the ones who endured the Allen diet and did not survive long enough to receive the injection. To the ones who chose food over survival and cannot be judged for it. To the children in the ward who died in the months before January 1922, who were so close to the answer that the distance between them and it is one of the genuinely unbearable facts of medical history. They are the ones who paid the full cost of living in a
The
world
knowledge
where medicine
carries
knows
forward,
what is killing you
and
and
the
cannot yet
obligation to
stop it.
carry it honestly remains.
What still remains, a century later, is the weight of that knowledge,
Keep your
and the
spirits up,
obligation to
gentlemen.
carry it honestly,
We're almost through the
without
worst
looking
of
away
it.
from what it cost,
Just
into whatever
rest
ward
now.
we are all,
You need your
sooner or
strength.
later, waiting in.